been a integral. Got it. Lorquin Entomological Society has been an integral part of my entomological upbringing, but we'll talk about that momentarily. As Jerry said, I wear a lot of hats. I was appointed by the governor of Virginia a few years ago as a trustee for the Virginia Museum of Natural History, our state museum. And I've been a research associate there since I moved to Richmond, Virginia in 2000. And I'm also a research associate at the California State Collection of Arthropods in Sacramento in conjunction with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And I've been a longtime research collaborator at the Smithsonian. I work primarily as an adjunct professor. I teach entomology, medical and veterinary entomology, and insects and humans for non-science majors at 3 of the local colleges and universities here. I also, for 10 years, had a radio segment on Richmond Public Radio, which aired during NPR's Morning Edition. And just recently, we took 6 of those episodes and animated them. So if you are interested in that sort of thing, be sure to check out my Facebook page at Dr. Art Evans, Entomologist. I try to do a little bit of research when I have time, working primarily on scarab beetles, but occasionally a few other things too. And I've written a number of books about insects and other arthropods, which of course brings us to the topic today. I'd like to share with you my latest book, Beetles of Western North America, that was published by Princeton University Press. It covers 1,428 species and all 131 families known to occur west of the Continental Divide. And I'll go through shortly and share some of the features of the book with you. Before I get too far, though, I want to thank all the photographers that contributed to this book. There's over 1,500 color images in the work. About half of them are mine, and the other half were photographed by 116 photographers. And without them, this book wouldn't have the breadth and the depth taxonomically that it does. And I'm forever grateful for the generosity of all these people, including several Lorquin members, I should mention, that contributed to this work. I also want to give a shout out to my good friend, Jen Reed in Ontario, Canada. Jen worked at the Canadian National Collection in Ottawa for many years and is an incredibly talented entomologist and technician. And she helped me with a lot of the images in the book, particularly those that involve morphology. And she made every image that appears in the book look its absolute best. And she also rendered several of the original illustrations for the book, especially those that appear in the Key to Families. The work covers beetles that live west of the Continental Divide from Alaska to Western Mexico. But let's be honest here, it focuses primarily on species that occur from southern British Columbia to Southern California and southeastern Arizona. There's an extensive introduction to beetles covering their morphology, their behavior. This is a nice spread that shows the larvae of different beetles, the diversity of beetles in terms of their larvae. Unfortunately, there's just not a lot of space to give larvae their due. I would love to do a book just on the larvae of beetles, but I'm not sure I'd find a publisher yet that would take that on. But here's an opportunity to see some of the more commonly encountered beetle larvae. There's also information on their behavior and natural history, parental care. And I also tried to highlight some of the research that's been done that's specific to Western North America. This is my friend Anna Holden, and some of you might be familiar with her work. She and her team worked with a cache of insects that was found inside a camel skull at La Brea tar pits. And this cache of insect fragments was dated approximately 40,000 years old. And there are a number of interesting things about this discovery. One is that many of the beetles as part of this discovery are either still in the area or haven't been seen for a long time. But in total, the species present indicate that the Los Angeles basin back 40,000 plus years ago was much warmer and drier than was previously thought. For many years, based on primarily bits and pieces of plants found in the tar pits, it was thought that during this time period, the Los Angeles area was much cooler and wetter. But now, based on this insect information, it's not. And one thing I wanted to point out was this fragment here. This is the head and pronotum of the black-legged ham beetle. Here's one here. And the black-legged ham beetle was thought to be a European species that was inadvertently introduced by the Europeans into North America. But the fact that its remains were found in this 40,000-year-old cache of insect remains indicates that the beetle was already here. And so it's possible that the species was introduced by the Europeans back into Europe, or that this species was whole Arctic in distribution. In other words, it was widely distributed throughout the Northern Hemisphere. At the moment, we're not really sure. Find my cursor here. There we go. Pardon me. There's also an extensive section on collecting beetles. I'm very much a believer in collecting beetles, not only to get the hands-on experience, but also to acquire accurate species identifications. Unlike other popular groups of insects, such as butterflies, some of the larger moths, dragonflies, and damselflies, and so on, beetles can be a real challenge to identify, and you often have to have them in hand. And sometimes it comes right down to the male's reproductive organs, which you have to dissect in order to properly identify species. So it's very important to collect voucher specimens, specimens that will be prepared and preserved for perpetuity and eventually deposited in a public collection where they're widely available to researchers. Some of the techniques that I point out here is fluming. This is a technique that's been written about by a couple of people over the years, and was something that was used by coleopterists early in the last century. As some of you might know, there are a series of flumes that run along the western foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And my good friend Dave Carlson took me to the spot not far from Sacramento and set up his pool nets and strapped them to a bridge and just captured leaf litter that was flowing down the stream. And then we would haul up the leaf litter and spread it out on a sheet and just slowly keep picking through the debris, and found some really interesting insects, and some very unusual beetles, and of course other insects are found by this method. Here's Matt Gimmel from the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History demonstrating how to use a white pan. White pans are incredibly useful for using as a beading sheet, simply placing them under flowers or branches and giving the vegetation a good whack, and the beetles will fall in and they're quickly sucked up with an aspirator. Or you can use it to sort through handfuls of moss or leaf litter or rotting wood. They're quite versatile and easy to carry around. Next to him is Bob Anderson, world-renowned beetle authority at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And Bob turned me on to this technique of sifting, putting leaf litter into a sifter and carefully shaking it, and all the siftate, the little bits, and all the beetles and other arthropods wind up in the bottom, forming sort of a bolus that you then suspend in a cloth funnel and let air dry. And in a matter of hours or just a day or two, all kinds of interesting beetles and other arthropods will wind up in a collection container, usually filled with alcohol. Here's a black light setup produced by BioQuip that was based in part on a design that Alex Reifschneider and I came up with many, many years ago using ripstop nylon. And this is my good friend Chris Worth. Chris Worth was 15 years old when I first met him here in Virginia, and now he's working on his PhD in tenebrionid beetles with Aaron Smith at Purdue. This is another good friend of mine. Some of you may know him, Ron McPeak. Ron is a retired marine biologist and scarab collector extraordinaire, and he's published several important works and is currently documenting the scarab beetles of San Diego County. Ron lives up in Vancouver, Washington, and I had the opportunity to spend a week with him, and he took me on a whirlwind tour of Oregon. And here we are, here's Ron, inspecting some pine slash. This was an incredibly productive day for us. It was just an area where a logging company had come in, piled up a bunch of freshly cut branches across some logs, and there were all kinds of wood-boring beetles all over the branches all day long. We kept just walking big circles around this area and finding new specimens all the time, which was great. Many of the photographs that appear in the book were taken at this site. And here's Ted McCrae. Many of you know him. He's a specialist on jewel beetles and longhorn beetles. He's based in St. Louis, Missouri. And here he's demonstrating how to use a beating sheet and using a net handle as a stick. Again, putting the sheet under a branch, giving it a good whack, and often finding beetles that you won't collect any other way. Typically, this is a method that most of us use either early in the morning or on cooler days. If you try this technique in the middle of the day, beetles will hit the sheet and fly off before you can even focus on them. But still, it's a very productive technique. Some of the other traps that I document here in the book, this is what Bill Warner has dubbed a V-fit trap. V in reference to the V shape of the plastic panels here, and fit for flight intercept trap. And this is a trap that Bill put together based on traps designed primarily to collect horse flies. And what you're seeing here is a metal frame made with conduit that's weighed down with rocks. And then you stretch some plastic sheeting between the two poles, and then take a weight, another pole, and just put it down across the middle to weigh it down so it's this V shape. And then right at the bottom, you put a series of pans and fill it with propylene glycol. This is a fluid that will capture beetles and other insects and preserve them for up to several weeks at a time until you can come along and scoop them out. Now, what happens here is that beetles and other insects will come flying along, and when they hit this panel, they keep going down, 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 down until they're directed right into the fluid. For those of you that use malaise traps, there's a single panel in the middle, and many beetles do go up and will wind up in the collection jar, but just as many, if not more, wind up going down. Now, some people go ahead and put these collecting troughs underneath that central panel in the malaise trap not to miss anything. This is based on that principle, but these traps are incredibly productive and have turned up species that are very poorly known by any other collecting methods. This is another trap that Barney Strait introduced to me in Arizona that Bill Warner introduced to him too. And let's just be frank here, it's called poop on a stick. And you take your favorite feces and just schmooze it on the end of a stick, shove it in the ground at an angle, and then take a bowl and bury it so the rim is flush. Fill it with propylene glycol, or you can use soapy water if it's something you're checking regularly over the next few hours or few days. And within hours, the dung beetles will just come in like crazy. And this is a very inexpensive, very simple trap to set up while you're on the go in the field. This is a trap that I started playing around with when I was a student in South Africa. There was a plethora of 2-liter soda bottles available. So we would collect them and cut off the soda bottle at the shoulders and then cut off the neck and use that little piece as a funnel, invert it, put it in place, and then hold it in place with just a wire loop. And before you do all that, of course, you fill it with decaying fruit or whatever your favorite bait is, something sweet and syrupy and smelly, and hang it up in a tree. And it works really well. In South Africa, the collecting was amazing. And we discovered too that not only was it very productive, but also the different heights that you put the trap make a difference as to the beetle fauna that falls into the trap. And I learned this by accident. I would usually hang the traps at eye level. And one time somebody came along, I don't know who, and took all the traps down, but just set them down gently on the ground. So they were still functional, but they were on the ground. And they were filled with beetles that I had only had 1 or 2 specimens of, or they were species that I hadn't seen at all. So I started alternating the traps. Now here in the East, when the humidity is high, these traps are incredibly useful as well. In the West, it's a different story. It's typically so dry in the West that usually you get a thick skin that dries over the top of your bait, and very quickly, within hours or days, it's not attractive at all. So this is a kind of a trapping method that you want to set up when you're staying in an area for several days or weeks at a time, and you're checking them regularly so you can freshen up the bait if you have to. This is a technique that I was just fooling around with. I was stumbling through a Lowe's here in Richmond, and I found these corncob feeders. It's just a coated heavy duty spiral trap, or a device that you put dried corn cobs in and use it to feed birds and squirrels. And the moment I saw it, I thought, why not fill it up with fruit? And so that's what I did in Arizona. I would just take plantains or bananas or sliced oranges and then set them up. And within just a few days, it's a great cotinus trap. You'll even get a euphoria too. I set up about a dozen of these traps in scattered places in southern Arizona, and I got several species of euphoria, but cotinus was by and far the most common beetle at these traps. I mentioned that the book includes an illustrated key to the common beetle families that are encountered in Western North America, to try and put together a key that will allow you to place every possible beetle species in its appropriate family, all 131 of them, is a fool's errand. And so I decided what to do is make a judgment call and develop a key that was based primarily on what I had in the Eastern book and detail it for the West. And so it covers 91 of the 131 families known to occur in the West. And these 91 families are families that most people would encounter. And when you're going through the couplets, it's just like a series of choices, different forks in the road. And based on your answers, you take a left or you take a right. And eventually you come up with a chunk of families that you can then check in the book and see if your specimen matches something that's in the book. So for each couplet that drops out into a collection of families, those families listed in bold are the most likely choices. And of course, they're cross-referenced, so you can easily go to that page. But if those don't pan out, then there's a series of plain text families that offer other alternatives for families that also have these same characteristics. The heart of the book is the family diagnoses, which lay out the morphological characteristics for each family. There's also a section on similar families. Sometimes the family in question is so distinctive that there isn't really much to say beyond the diagnosis. But in other families, you'll see a list of bulleted points where families look superficially similar, and listed on those points are characteristics that'll help distinguish them from the family at hand. And of course, there's collecting notes for each family too. Once again, I'm a firm believer in the importance of collecting specimens and maintaining collections. And so this is to give you some tips on where you might find these insects, and also at times suggest trapping techniques that are useful as well. The fauna includes the number of species and genera found in the United States and Canada. So this gives you an idea as to the diversity of the family. And then there are a number of species accounts that include information that will help separate that particular species. At the very end of each account, there's a number in parentheses, and that indicates the number of species found in that genus that are known to occur west of the Continental Divide. So if you see a relatively low number here, then you can be reasonably confident that maybe the specimen you have is comparable, or is the species represented here. If you see a high number, be very cautious in assigning an identification. Remember, I said that for most beetles, you need to have them in hand. I know that a lot of people like to photograph beetles and not collect specimens, and then they hope that someone can give them an authoritative identification. That just isn't possible. with many species of beetles. And it's very difficult sometimes to see just one photograph of a beetle and be able to see everything you need to see. So once again, I encourage people to collect voucher specimens, preserve them, label them, and keep that collection, or pass it along to a public museum. Pardon me, I'm very dry tonight. You'll notice that I've included the authority name after all of the species. Many field guides don't do this, in part because of space considerations or because it just isn't felt to be necessary. But including the authority is part of the scientific name. So I make a point of doing that. And as you're going through these pages, notice that a couple of names keep popping up: LeConte and Horn and Casey. And I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about these very important figures in coleopterology. If there was a Western equivalent to a Mount Rushmore-like monument to the important coleopterists of the West, it might look like something along these lines, using, of course, the Mount Whitney and the Sierra Nevadas as a backdrop. John LeConte tops the list. He was one of the most eminent entomologists of the 19th century. He described 5,000 new species of beetles, many of which occurred in Western North America. And he was a pioneer of the classification of North American beetles. He traveled extensively during the Civil War throughout Southern California and parts of Arizona collecting. George Horn was a contemporary, although a few years younger. He too arrived in California during the Civil War. He was stationed at Camp Independence in Owens Valley. He collected beetles throughout the state, as well as in Arizona and Nevada. He described over 100 new genera and just short of 2,000 new species, and collaborated with LeConte on several important publications. And upon LeConte's death in 1883, he became the preeminent coleopterist in North America. Now, Thomas Lincoln Casey lived in California relatively briefly in the 1880s, but he spent a lot of time in the field collecting beetles all up and down the state, during which time he secured a wealth of material. Over his 40-year career, he described nearly 10,000 new species, publishing almost 9,000 pages on their taxonomy. This is just a mind-boggling number. However, much of Casey's work has been criticized, as many of his species were synonyms of previously described taxa. Casey was known not to consult other collections or literature. He focused just on his own collections, and for large variable species, he was known to describe them multiple times. But it turns out that many of the smaller, lesser known species of beetles, his species concepts appear to be fairly accurate, and a lot of his work has stood up. One of my favorite coleopterists in this group is Henry Clinton Fall, and he made significant contributions to the study of beetles in North America, especially in the West. And it's worth noting that his first paper, which was published in 1893 on beetles that he had collected in the San Bernardino Mountains, the publication of that paper was inspired by a visit from George Horn. Just years before Horn's death, he went out to California for the last time, spent some time in Southern California and at the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco, studying the collections there and describing new species. Fall's collection was one of the finest private collections of its day, and it contained over 200,000 specimens representing 20,000 species. And his collection now resides with those of LeConte and Horn at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard. The reason I got interested in Fall is because even though he spent the end of his days in Massachusetts, he was a science teacher in Southern California. He started his teaching career at teaching high school science in Pomona, and eventually settled at Pasadena High School, which went on to become Pasadena City College. And a few years back, I had this idea, and I still want to do it, a biography of Fall, because he had a really interesting life. I visited Pasadena City College and went to their library, and there were annuals available from Fall's time. And I got to see Fall as a young man as he appeared as a teacher there. And I believe, I haven't tried to prove this just yet, but I know that my grandfather, Arthur Thomas Evans, was a student at Pasadena High School at the same time that Fall was there. And I sort of have it in the back of my mind that someday I'll see if there's a real connection there, whether he had him Fall for a teacher. The last entomologist that I wanted to point out was Edwin Van Dyke, and he was an outstanding authority on the beetles of the Pacific states. He was also an expert on forest pests and the distribution of insects, especially of beetles in Western North America. He published at least 3 papers on the distribution of beetles and other insects in Western North America, which is really fascinating reading, especially given the time that they were published in the 1920s and 1930s. Van Dyke was an inspirational teacher as well as an enthusiastic and conscientious collector. I mention conscientious collector because he writes in several of his publications about finding valuable specimens in delicate habitats under bark, under stones, and making a point of saying that you should return bark and stones in their place, so you can always go back to those habitats. His collection of 200,000 beetles was presented to the California Academy of Sciences in San Francisco in 1924. This is no small thing because, as some of you might know, almost the entire collection of beetles, many other collections, were destroyed by the fires that followed the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. This book is dedicated to a number of people, family and mentors and good friends who fueled my passion for beetles. And I'd like to spend the next part of this presentation sharing something about these people. My parents, Ed and Lois Evans, were incredibly supportive of me as a young entomologist. Dad was an electrician, civil engineer at Edwards Air Force Base. And because of his skills as an electrician, when I was very young, he installed a mercury vapor light on our garage wall in Juniper Hills, which was on the southern fringes of the Mojave Desert. And he didn't do it to light up the property. He did it so he knew that insects were attracted to mercury vapor lights, and he put it there just so I could collect insects. And I collected insects and photographed insects at that light for about half a century. And my mother put together my first insect net, and there it is right there. This is me at the tender age of 13 in the Sierra Nevada, not far from June Lake. And that's my first net, made from a broom handle, a coat hanger, and some cheesecloth sewn together. Yes, those are pesky corners in that net. I had a devil of a time getting things out. But up to that point, I couldn't catch a lot of the things that I was interested in. So I was very interested in insects from early on, and starting in 1970 is when I began making an insect collection. Up to that point, I was just watching them or watching them die in a container. I didn't have the heart to kill them myself. 4-H had an important role in my entomological development. Many of my friends at the time were in 4-H, had horses and chickens and goats and guide dogs and things like that. I didn't have any of those things. I had an insect collection, and none of the adults were comfortable with their knowledge about insects. So I became a junior leader, and I basically ran the section for entomology. And when I was in the 6th grade, we had a demonstration day, and that meant everybody got together with their chickens and goats and their horses and their other projects and put them on display for the public. So everybody was outside with their animals, and I was the only person inside with my insect collection. And I had 5 cigar boxes with my collection and my Golden Guide field guides there at the ready to answer questions and to share with people my fascination for insects. And this gentleman on the left walked in and introduced himself as Chris Henney. And he was the first entomologist I ever met. Turns out he was a preparator at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles back in the 1940s, and he was a renowned lepidopterist. And he was dropping names of other lepidopterists who I knew, but I didn't recognize their names. He had worked with John Comstock. He had worked with Lloyd Martin. So I was really excited about meeting him, and he invited me to his home, which wasn't that far away. Now, by this time, I was already starting to lean a little bit into beetles, but not quite. And when I walked into Chris's home, I was just floored. He had this immaculate collection. He collected moths primarily, but butterflies too. And he raised all of his specimens from eggs. So they were all in perfect condition and beautifully prepared and perfectly labeled in his collection. And he had a rearing room with all these flower pots set up with host plants and all these different caterpillars. It was really heady stuff. And he was very generous with me and very friendly. And he set up my first visit for a behind the scenes look at the entomology department at the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles. Also during this time, I entered high school, and I had two very influential high school biology teachers, Bob Brister and Mike Hanlon. And I'm still in contact with Bob Brister today. They team taught one of the best courses I've ever had in my life, and that was field biology. And in between my sophomore and junior years, I attended this class, and we went on at least 2 day trips every week and 1 overnight trip. We had to make an insect collection. We had to make a shell collection. We had to prepare study skins. We did plant presses, press plant specimens. We also learned about vegetation mapping. And also we went to several natural history museums in San Diego and botanical gardens in the Los Angeles area. It was just a phenomenal course that really fueled my passion for field biology. That very first trip to the museum that Chris Henney set up, I put together a box of specimens that I wasn't sure what I had, but I wanted to convince whoever I met in entomology that I was serious. And one of the people I just happened to meet by dumb luck there was Bob Duff. As many of you know, Bob was a longtime member of the Lorquin Society and sadly passed away earlier this year. And Bob was a tremendous influence on me as a budding entomologist. And between the years 1973 to 1978, we went on many field trips together throughout Southern California, Arizona, Southern New Mexico, and even one year as far west as Western Texas. Bob introduced me to the coleoptera of Western North America, and he single-handedly inspired me to focus on scarab beetles, which I'm still working on today. Now, also that fateful day at the Natural History Museum, I met the 3 curators there at the time: Hymenopterist Roy Snelling, Lepidopterist Julian Donahue, and Dipterist Charlie Hogue. Charlie had a long-lasting influence on me, not only because he was just such a superb entomologist and just a lot of fun, but he was also interested in informal science education. He wrote popular books and popular articles. He was an excellent insect photographer, and that inspired me. I have to say it didn't catch on early on, but I always thought, you know, one of these days I'd like to do some of the things that Charlie did, and now I've gotten a chance to do some of those very things. And I'm very proud to say, thanks to his son Jim, some of Charlie's photographs do appear in Beetles of Western North America. And those images are particularly of interest to me because I collected the beetles that Charlie photographed. He always said, if you find something good, find something interesting, bring it in and I'll take a photograph of it. And so I did. Bob Duff also kept telling me about Elbert Sleeper at Cal State Long Beach. Sleeper was a well-known authority on weevils, and I enrolled as an undergraduate there in 1979 as a junior. And during the summer, just weeks before school started, I was in Madera Canyon, like many of us are wont to do that time of year, had the black lights going at Bog Springs Campground, and out of the shadows, this gentleman came up to me and introduced himself as Chuck Bellamy. And that was the beginning of a friendship that lasted 35 years. Chuck quickly became one of my best friends. We were college roommates. We shared cubicles side to side or side by side at Cal State Long Beach. And it was through Chuck's urging that I decided to go to South Africa and earn my doctorate in entomology. I moved to South Africa in 1985. I studied there for 3 years. Here's a photograph in the upper left of, there's Chuck and me. That's me without a shirt. Many of us have very long faces because it was stupid hot, stupid humid. This was our first night in the field, and there was something walking around our camp all night long. So none of us got much sleep. But this was my first trip to the tropics. All of my friends went to southern Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama, but I didn't get to the New World tropics until many, many years later. My first experience was in Africa. On the right is a good friend of mine, Marcus Byrne. We're picking through a carcass looking for beetles. I believe that was a zebra there. Marcus Byrne, you might recognize his name. He's the co-author of Dance of the Dung Beetles. And if you haven't seen his TED Talk on how dung beetles navigate using the stars, you owe it to yourself to check out this video. It's very well done. He's an incredibly generous person and just a wonderful scientist. While I was in South Africa, I focused my efforts on scarab beetles, and in particular, I studied melanothine scarabs. For those of you that aren't that familiar with scarabs, the melanothines are the plain black, brown, June bug looking things that often come to your lights, sometimes in large numbers. That's where the diversity is in scarabs, and that's where the greatest work needs to be done. And so that's what I focused my graduate studies on there. When I returned from South Africa, I had a long-standing interest in informal science education, and the Natural History Museum in Los Angeles had just received a $2 million grant from the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation to start an insect zoo. Now, back then, insect zoos weren't that common. In fact, there were only 3 in the United States, one at the Smithsonian and the other 2 at the Cincinnati and San Francisco insect zoos. And my first thought was, no way, insect zoos, that just sounds like a lot of pressure to me. All those live insects that you have to keep alive, give me a dead pinned insect anytime. But literally one night I woke up and I thought, I can do this. And I began lobbying everybody at the museum that I was the guy to make this happen. And sure enough, they hired me. And for 10 years, I helped create a cradle to grave bug program. We had a traveling insect zoo that went out to schools and shopping centers, libraries, and summer camps. We developed a workshop to encourage teachers to incorporate insects into their curricula. And as Jerry mentioned, I helped organize the insect fair. Now, I didn't create the insect fair. That was the brainchild of Steve Kutcher, and the Lorquin Entomological Society put that on for several years at the LA County Arboretum. And then I got involved and made it organized it under the auspices of the Insect Zoo, and eventually moved it to the Natural History Museum, where pre-pandemic it became the largest public event held at the Natural History Museum. While I was at the museum, I was approached by a company and asked if I would be interested in putting together a coffee table book on beetles. And I jumped at the opportunity. And then all of a sudden I thought, what have I done? This is kind of a book that you would write mid-career, at the end of career. I was just getting started. And so immediately I thought, misery loves company. Who could I get involved in this? And Chuck Bellamy volunteered to help me. Chuck had just received a post back in South Africa. And so, of course, he moved back to Pretoria. I'm in California as we're trying to start this book. Fortunately, there was this newfangled means of communication called electronic mail, and we would send chapters back and forth, and that's how An Inordinate Fondness for Beetles was written. Then I became involved as a contributor to American Beetles, which is the handbook of beetle identification for the US and Canada, and I wrote the section on the melanothine scarabs. And by this time, University of California Press picked up the softcover version of An Inordinate Fondness for Beetles. They were also co-publishing a natural history of the Sonoran Desert with the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum. And when I wrote the section on beetles for this book, and when they had their book launch at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, I was approached by the acquisitions editor at the University of California and said, "So what's your next book?" And fortunately, I had an answer at the ready. I said, "I'd like to do a handbook on the beetles of California." And that turned into these two books, Introduction to California Beetles and A Field Guide to Beetles of California. And of course, just as I took on this task, I moved to the East Coast, and I thought I really need a co-author who knows beetles, who does photography, who does superb illustrations, and actually lives in California, so I could help pull this off. And Charlie's son, Jim, offered to work with me on this book, and I was forever grateful for his help, and he's been a great friend to me ever since. While working in and living and working in Richmond, Virginia, I try to get as much research done as I can. And I've been involved in a collaborative effort with Andrew Smith at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And the two of us are slowly working through the melalonthines of the New World. And our most recent paper was published last year on the tribal classification of the Nearctic melalonthini. And among other things, we have now placed all melalonthine genera in tribes for the first time. And also we provide a detailed description of the only known specimen of a female acoma. Unless you've been out to some of the desert areas in southeastern California or Arizona, you may not be familiar with acoma, but the males are fully winged, readily come to lights during the hottest part of the summer, but the females were unknown, except for one specimen that was taken near the Chiricahuas. And it was taken by a class headed up by Montказir. And as suspected, it is flightless. And so even though the specimens have been known for decades, it's never been described. And of course, in Richmond, I do other things too. I teach, and also I'm a radio broadcaster too for 10 years, which I already mentioned. During my time here in Richmond, I wrote the companion book to the Western Guide, The Beetles of Eastern North America. And this is sort of what got me thinking about, if I can finish this book, maybe I'll take a stab at the Western one. And so when I turned in the manuscript, I was working in real time with the art department, who was a guy in England. And so we're trading emails back and forth. It's 4:30 in the morning, my time. I just finished the index and sent it off. I slept for about 5 hours, woke up, and that's when I wrote the draft of a proposal to do beetles of Western North America, and it was provisionally accepted within 2 weeks. Another project that I got involved in was a lot of fun, the Book of Beetles. And this is a fantastic work published by the University of Chicago Press. And it has these gorgeous photographs of 600 species of beetles around the world, including 220 families. And I was one of the many contributing authors to this book, but I also wrote the introduction and several other parts of the end papers to this work. And if you haven't seen this book, check it out. If you like beetles, or if you just like colorful photographs, this is definitely something to look at. Now, while living here in Richmond, I undertook 5 what I call Buena tours, the beetles of Western North America. So from 2010 to 2018, I made 5 trips out west, and I drove over 8,000 miles to photograph as many species of beetles that I could. And as you can see from the areas here, I traveled from Western Oregon through many parts of California and all over Arizona on these trips. I promised Jerry that I would mention a little bit about the photography. I don't really have a good photo of me or my rig, so I pinched some things from online, but basically I've used a number of cameras over the years, but currently I'm using a Canon EOS 7D. I don't consider myself a photographer. I'm an entomologist that knows how to take a certain kind of insect picture well. So I don't have the patience to fiddle around with a lot of settings and setting up backgrounds and all these sorts of things. I'm just interested in getting a result. And when I say a result, I'm looking for what I call a field guide photograph, something that will convey the overall gestalt of a particular species, and combined with a cogently written diagnosis, somebody else can come along and they can feel reasonably confident that maybe they too have this particular species. So I'm using the old 100 millimeter macro lens. The one I have doesn't have all the stabilizing elements. I just haven't gotten there yet. I've used a number of different flash rigs, but the one I'm currently using now is the Twin Light by Canon, the MT24 EX. And for several years, I really struggled with diffusers. Just using these flashes on their own, the lights are too hot for most beetles. In other words, parts of the beetles are blown out. Shiny beetles are always a challenge regarding what you're using as a diffuser. But thanks to the suggestion of a couple of photographers that helped me with both the Eastern and Western books, I found these diffusers from England, and they work really well. And there are many diffusers out there. I know a lot of people like to do their own kind of thing and experiment. I don't. I just want something that works. I want to slap it on. I want to go. I want to get the shot. I don't like the tinkering part. So I bought a couple of these kits, and there's the URL down below there, microdiffuser.com. And if you have an interest in checking these out, go to that website and you'll see other people out there, well-known photographers that are using them too. And they certainly have worked for me. As you saw earlier, I spent a lot of time in Arizona. And of course, the big draw in Arizona is the Sky Islands. And the Sky Islands are sort of an archipelago of isolated mountain ranges that include the Babaquivris, the Chiricahuas, Huachucas, Santa Catalinas, and Santa Rita Mountains. And these areas are just superb. They're isolated by deserts and grasslands, and they sort of form this chain of islands that connect the Colorado Plateau with the Rocky Mountains to the Sierra Madre Occidental to the south. The term Sky Islands is used very commonly today. But the person who first coined the concept of Sky Islands, or the term Sky Islands, was Weldon Heald. Weldon Heald was a well-known nature writer, and he referred to the concept of Sky Islands in an article that he wrote of the same name in a natural history magazine that was published in 1951. In 1966, he published a book called Sky Island, and it was on the natural and human history of the Chiricahua Mountains. It was reprinted in the early 70s, called the Chiricahua Mountains, and I believe the University of Arizona reprinted it again and expanded it in the early 90s and called it the Chiricahua Mountains Sky Island, or something along those lines. But if you're not familiar with this book, it's still available through your favorite used book dealers, and it's well worth a read. And it's the last chapter that I found the most compelling. He and his wife were getting ready to leave their Rainbow Ranch in Cave Creek in the Chiricahuas. They were looking for a buyer, and this gentleman came walking up the road and introduced himself as Montcasir. And as some of you know, Montcasir was a well-known entomologist at the American Museum. For many years, he was the director of the Southwest Research Station in the Chiricahuas. He worked on tiger beetles, he worked on flies, he worked on many different groups. And Kazir was looking for property to buy on behalf of the American Museum where they could start a field station. And Heald's Rainbow Ranch became the Southwest Research Station. And their home and that swimming pool that you drive by as you're going up the road, that was the home of the Healds for many years. So what makes this area so compelling are all the different biotic influences. You've got, as I mentioned, the Rocky Mountains to the north. You've got the Sierra Madre Occidental to the south, as well as the neotropical influences. To the west, you have the Sonoran Desert. To the east, you've got the Great Plains and the Chihuahuan Deserts, and all these very different biotic regions mixed together in these mountains, and you find a collection of plants and animals, the diversity of which is unmatched here in the United States. And I know that for most of you, I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. Now, I can't possibly cover Arizona beetles to the extent that they need to be covered. And as many of you know, Margarita Brummerman has been working on this magnum opus on the Arizona beetles and has been photographing them. And I joined forces with her a couple of years ago, and hopefully in a couple of years we'll get this done. But we're working on Arizona beetles, and right now she's got the plates done, and I've got the manuscript about halfway written. This guide is going to cover more than 2,200 species of beetles and 83 families that occur in Arizona. And this is an example of just one of the plates that will be in the book. I'd like to end this presentation with just some of my favorite beetles and my favorite beetle photographs that are included in the book. Of course, one of my favorite insects in Arizona is this bad boy. This is Dinutus sublineatus. This is the largest species of whirligig beetle that we have in the United States. Unlike species of Gyrinus, Dinutus tends to be, at least in the West, tends to be more of a singular animal. You might find just one or two on a pool along a slow-moving stream. Occasionally they come to lights, but I've always been fascinated by these beetles. To me, it's like seeing an old friend. A family of beetles that you will find nowhere else in the world but Western North America are the Diphilostomatids, represented by a single genus, Diphilostoma. The males are fully winged, and they are usually found flying during the day, often in the mornings. And that spot I showed you along the flume, they're often scooped up along with leaf litter in the water. That's why we were there that day. I didn't find any. The females are apterous. They're wingless. And fortunately for me, Bill Tyson, who lives near Corsgold in California, had photographed a specimen that he collected. One morning, he just happened to be looking out his window, and he has Diphilostoma in his yard, and he saw a male hovering over some leaf litter, and then it just dove in and buried itself, and he ran out and he scooped it up, and it was already attempting to mate with this wingless female. Speaking of wingless females, another specialty of Western North America, the rain beetles in the family Pleocomidae. Pleocoma octopagina is so named because in each lamellate antenna consists of 8 lamellae. Rain beetles can fan them out, as you see here, or they can fold them tightly together in a club. And when I went to that behind the scenes tour of the Natural History Museum for the first time, I had a pair of Pleocoma octopagina in that box. I didn't know what they were. They were waterlogged. I scooped them out of a swimming pool in the middle of February, not far from my parents' home. And Bob Duff recognized them right away. And it turned out that these were the first specimens that were known outside of the type locality, which was on the family property of Noel McFarland. I'm sure many of you recognize that name. Noel lived at a place not far from Devil's Punch Bowl, which was just west of my home. The females are apterous. They have just little strips of wings, if they have that at all, and they attract males by pheromone, and they usually just come up to the surface. Sometimes you'll find them walking around after rains. This is a female that I was lucky enough to collect in 2016. And I was too tired to get up in the wee hours of the morning to visit this site after a rain. So I got there at 11 o'clock in the morning. Everything had cleared up. And I was just walking around for old time's sake. I hadn't been there in 30 years, but I remembered it very well. And I saw this hole at the bottom of the road. And I just thought, you know, I wonder. And I did exactly what you're never supposed to do and stick your finger in the hole. And sure enough, I felt the female inside. And so that's where this photo came from. Someone mentioned earlier Chrysina. And of course, they formerly known as Plusiotis. These are real crowd pleasers. There are 3 species in southeastern Arizona. Chrysina byeri is found on oaks. Chrysina gloriosa is much more widespread throughout Arizona and into western Texas, and is on juniper. And Chrysina leconti as an adult is found on pines. We have one more species of Chrysina that occurs in the United States, and it's in western Texas, and the adults feed on walnut. Speaking of crowd pleasers, here are a couple of handsome horned beetles. Both of these are found in Arizona, Dynastes grantii. And you'll notice the spelling on this. This is the proper spelling with two I's at the end. I've misspelled it myself in other publications, but as you know, priority rules in the world of taxonomy, and the original spelling as it appeared in its original description, that's what carries the day. And that's how horn spelled grantii with two I's. And Brett Ratcliffe is the one that brought this to our attention. The ox beetle, Strategus aloeus, I remember for years, in my teenage years, I got lots of females, never found a male. And then since I moved to Virginia and I've gone back to Arizona several times, I seem to find more males than females. I have no idea how to explain that. One of the beetles I wanted to photograph for this book was Euphoria monticola. Some of you might remember the old name Holochlorus. Euphoria monticola flies at the very beginning of the monsoons in southern Arizona, and I'd always missed the very beginning. Usually I get there about 2 weeks after the rains start. If I'm lucky, I find one beat up adult, or I find bits and pieces of dead ones everywhere. Well, in 2018, I just happened to be in Arizona the first day the monsoons hit, and the flight of these beetles, Euphoria monticola, was just spectacular. And also Gymnotina crotacea. There are several species known from Arizona, but they're all black with very distinctive white markings. They too tend to fly at the beginning of the monsoons. Buprestids, I was always aware of Buprestidae thanks to my friend Chuck Bellamy, but because it was work to get them, you couldn't just put out bait, you couldn't just blacklight for them. A Buprestid back in those days had to fly into my net before I collected very many. I never did any beating, and to this day I beat like crazy now, but back then I never did. So I certainly had Chuck on the brain as I was collecting and photographing beetles. This is Gaiascutus. I was driving from Southern California to southeastern Arizona. It was a very dark and stormy night on the California side, and I pulled over in a creosote scrub area. I just wanted to set up a black light and see what would come in, if anything, and the air was abuzz with these beetles. It was just spectacular. There were hundreds of them flying around just at dark. There were so many of them, they were even bumbling into the light, and they were feeding on creosote. This yellow waxy coating is very difficult to preserve in specimens. And so I worked very hard not only to photograph specimens that the coloring hadn't rubbed off, but also to preserve voucher specimens that have most of that coloring, and I was successful. Click beetles abound in Western North America. And again, Arizona has some of the larger, more colorful species, although there is a widespread eyed click beetle found in California in the pine regions, but species of Calcoloptius are certainly one of my favorites, Smaragdinus in particular. They're either a deep, shiny metallic blue or this brilliant sort of bronzy green in color. Again, it's like seeing an old friend. This is a beetle that I've always been interested in because I thought the antennae of the males were cool. And while I was working as a student worker at the Natural History Museum, I became aware that the females are brachypterous. They're flightless, they have reduced elytra, and people in the foothills around the Los Angeles area would occasionally find them. I remember Julian Donahue in the Mount Washington area would find them occasionally. I never did. I really wanted to include one in the book, but there were no decent photographs that I could find. And just weeks before I turned in the manuscript, I just happened to be looking online one more time. And darn if that Bug Bob Allen didn't come through for me with this beautiful photograph of a male. And thanks to Jen Reed, we were able to combine my photograph of the male with his female to make a nice shot there of the species. Netwing beetles have always been interesting to me just because I like their bright colors, those mating swarms they put together. It's always a great story to talk about in terms of aposematic coloration. I live in a place now where fireflies abound every year. We have one species very common in my yard. We have at least 3 species that occur around here in the neighborhood, but I didn't learn about lampreyrids in the West until much later. And I know that Charlie Hogue introduced me to the Greek theater and said that along the walkway there, people often commented on finding the adult larviform females, the glowworms, along the walkways there. And some of my neighbors in Sierra Madre, where I lived for several years, told me of an area where I could find these beetles. And so I drove there one night and I found not only the female, but I also found one where one male was copulating with her and 2 more were jockeying for position. And I'm glad to finally get that shot in the book. Fangodids, when I made that first trip to the Natural History Museum, the night before, I found this larviform female. I'd seen them before. I had no idea what they were. I put it in a jar in the pile next to my collection, woke up in the middle of the night and the jar was aglow. This is the very first bioluminescent organism I had ever seen in my life. At 2 in the morning, my mother wasn't nearly as impressed as I was. I took it into the Natural History Museum along with my collection. And I remember Roy Snelling just popped up and looked at it very quickly and said, fangodid. And that was my introduction to Roy and fangodids. The males are commonplace at lights and foothill areas during the late spring and early summer. The larvae are millipede predators. This is an eastern Fangodes, another genus preying on a millipede. Fangodes does occur in Arizona. In California, we have just the one genus, Sarhippus, of which there are 3 species. Cerebrionids are always fun. Chris Worth is working on a revision of the tribe that includes Edrodes. I have warm memories of these because at the school I attended in Little Rock, California, they were all over the playground in spring. And I remember filling up my Superman lunch pail with them and taking them home and setting up a terrarium. Those of you that have worked at insect zoos, I'm sure you're very familiar with the blue death feigners. And sometimes they're called desert ironclad beetles, which is a little confusing because true ironclad beetles are in another family, the Zopharidae. I've always been interested in meloids. One of the other early entomologists I met was John Pinto at the University of California, Riverside. Again, at a 4-H conference, I broke away on my own, made a beeline to entomology, and I saw somebody sitting in their office and I introduced myself and it was John Pinto. And he was very kind to take me around and show me some cool beetles in the collection. Clarid beetles are always interesting just because some of them have aposematic colors or they're trying to look like a more aggressive or obnoxious stinging insect. Some of them look more like wasps or ants and are always a pleasure to find in the field. I don't get enough blue insects in my life, and I'll bet you don't either. I love seeing these in Arizona and the wooded canyons, not only the adults, but also the larvae and the trees where the larvae are getting ready to pupate. And of course, the larvae pupate at the very end of their last exuvium, the last shed exoskeleton. And so I always think these are really interesting. They're very common, but I just think they're interesting. And in spite of its name, Californicus, they're nowhere found in California or Baja California. And yes, the name is back to Cyphrotylus. It bounced back and forth, but it seems to be settled in Cyphrotylus. Longhorn beetles, I grew up with Praunus crashing into the lights and our screen doors at night in Juniper Hills near Little Rock. This beetle is of interest to me. It is a mimic of, not only a mimic of netwing beetles, but it's also a predator of netwing beetles, and you will find them occasionally in mating swarms of similarly marked netwing beetles. I have yet to find them together. I've checked many mating swarms over the years and never found a predatory cerambycid, but we did find some of these once on some oaks that were apparently attracted to these galls that were forming in the involucres. Several species of cerambycids, longhorn beetles on cactus. Monolema is another really interesting species that I kept alive and on display at the insect zoo in Los Angeles. They're fairly long-lived. This beetle, Megapurpurcentus magnificus, only emerges every 3 years and does so for only a few days. This was a year that was big for them. You'll find them in oak woodlands for those couple of days. That's it. I was not there at the right time or place in 2018, but someone heard that I was looking to photograph interesting beetles for this book, and they let me borrow one for 20 minutes and let me photograph their specimen. So I was able to get a nice shot in the book. Weevils, Bob Anderson has sort of got me thinking about weevils these days. I know more about weevils than I ever thought I would. When I'm out and about, I don't just focus on beetles, but usually I do. So I thought I'd just offer up some eye candy, mainly from Arizona, of other insects that I photographed while I was working on the beetles of Western North America. This is one of those lucky shots where the cicada was very cooperative, and it wasn't until I was looking at the photo on my screen that I realized she was laying eggs, and you can see the little divots where she was inserting her eggs in this grass stem. Only twice have I had a camera in my hands when I saw a Pepsis wasp dragging a tarantula, and both times I was kind of fumbly, but this one I felt reasonably confident in sharing. I'd like to end this presentation by thanking my wife, Paula, who is sitting here off to my side. Without her love and support, I could never have taken on this book, nor could I have done many of the entomological projects I've been involved with since moving to Virginia. And here we all are, all rosy-cheeked in Madera Canyon a few years ago. Okay, so I mentioned that if any of you are interested in autograph copies, Beetles of Western North America is available at your favorite bookseller. It is everywhere. But if you would like an autographed or an inscribed copy, here's what you do. Go to bioquip.com and go immediately to my cart. You'll see a series of buttons on the left. And then when that page comes up, type in the catalog number 3811WS. That's a special part number. What that means is that, and when you update your cart, Beetles of Western North America will immediately appear on that form. And then you follow the prompts to checkout. And then just before you say complete your order, at the bottom of the page, there's a notes field, and indicate if you want your book autographed or inscribed. Now, an autograph is just my signature. And if you would like it inscribed, then I'm happy to make it out to you. Or if there's a message you would like written to someone, I'm happy to do that. You can't see them behind me, but the books are sitting behind me right now. These aren't coming from a pile somewhere that I've already signed or something like that. I wait to get your order from BioQuip, and as soon as it comes in, I will sign your book, pack it up, and mail it to you directly. So once again, go to bioquip.com, type in the catalog number 3811WS. Those are capital letters, W for West, S for signature. Update your cart, follow the prompts to checkout, and then indicate whether you want it autographed or inscribed. I have talked a long time. You've been a great audience. I very much appreciate being able to take part in these meetings and see so many friends that I don't get to see very often. I'll end with one of my favorite vistas in Arizona. This is from the Patagonia Mountains looking west at Babaquiviri Peak. And Tucson's to the right and Nogales is to the left. Thank you very much. And if anybody has any questions, I'll turn my screen over and I'd be happy to talk with you.
Fantastic.
That was great, Art. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. I
Great
can't believe
job.
how many parallels you and I have in our childhoods. It's amazing.
Well, I bring this up now because for those of us who are at least 40 plus, you start thinking a lot about how did I get here? And I realized that a lot of the people who were instrumental in helping me along the way are no longer here. And I think it's important that for those that still are, you let them know what they meant to you. And so I did that with this book.
Yeah, I loved your history part. That was really excellent.
Well, it's all stunned silence. It doesn't have to be about me. If we're done, I'd be happy just to listen to all of you talk. I hope that, you know, I realize it's been a long time already. It's dinner time there. I'm on the other side of that here, but I'm happy to chat or I'm happy to go. Just let me know. I'll follow my cues.
Yeah, Linnell just walked by the door with dinner saying, "I'm eating, bye."
In the chat, Christy says Beetles of Eastern North America covers east of Mississippi. When are you going to put out a field guide to the Beetles of the Great Plains?
Yeah, well, I am guilty of flying over the Midwest more than collecting in the Midwest. And Texas deserves its own book. I mean, you know, the Eastern book certainly covers Eastern Texas, but Western Texas is a different animal. At the very least, you've got a lot of Western species, but different subspecies. That's a whole nother thing. At the moment, I don't have any plans to do the Midwest. I did blurt out to my publisher once that they've been talking about doing an ebook for ever since the Eastern book came out. I'm not a big user of ebooks. I'm kind of old fashioned. I like to hold these things in my hands, no batteries required. And so I had this idea, if they wanted to do an ebook, I might be willing to combine the Eastern and Western books and then throw in another 500 species that are specialties of the Midwest. This is me wildly speculating. There's no plans afoot, made no proposals. I've already got other things that I need to finish. The American Beetles that I mentioned earlier, there's a reboot afoot, and I'm one of 3 managing editors on that project, and that'll be out in 2026. So, you know, I'm not lacking for things to do at the moment. But I like your enthusiasm for such a project.
Thank you very much, Art. I'm going to go feed my wife. And Paula, thank you for sharing the evening with us.
Thank you.
Art, like I say, you'll be getting a package sometime within the next year.
The next year, okay. Thank
Depends
you.
on how soon it gets there.
All right.
For the rest of you, thank you very much for coming. I see a lot of old faces, a lot of young faces, people I haven't seen for a few years. Stay safe. Kim, thank you very, very much.
Yes, thank you. And just
You're
one last thing. If I didn't get to your questions in the chat, you're welcome to go to my Dr. Art Evans Entomologist page on Facebook, and there's a button there that says email now, and you'll send me your question to me there. It's arthurevans@verizon.net. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd be happy to talk with you about whatever you feel like talking about. And again, thank you all so much for joining tonight.
Thank you, Art.
Thank you
Thanks,
so
Art.
much, Art. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. You are best.